All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode, the Mindgasms podcast. Going to do another philosophy episode with Tim Keefe today. We're going to go through another essay in that book called Deleuze's Philosophical Lineage. And we're going to go through Deleuze's thoughts on David Hume, the famous philosopher, of course. So, yeah, do you want to get us started off there, Tim?
Sure thing. Okay, so I've been looking forward to this one because I think what Deleuze has to say about Hume is quite interesting, more so than what he has said up until now. And just as a review here, so in the book itself, we have covered Plato, Duns Scotus, Leibniz, and now Hume. Okay, so just a quick review. Deleuze's project is to overturn Platonism, to get away from the transcendence and move more towards the immanent.
Mm-hmm.
The univocity of being, which he took from Duns Scotus, which is whatever you have to say about, say, if you're talking about God versus created creatures, that when you speak about being, you are speaking about the same thing, speaking in one voice instead of two different senses of being.
Right.
And then with Leibniz, the main insight there is about difference and about, we talked about standpoint with the body. That's where relativism comes in, but relativism in a subtle sense and not the idiotic sense
Yeah.
that we find him when he talks about it's all relative, man. No, it's not. Just shut up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and about how with when you're talking about identity between two separate individuals, there is more of a degree of difference than there is about specific. You could say essential differences between the two. So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's it in a nutshell. We're not gonna go too much into that. People can look at the previous episodes to get a better sense of what that is.
Yeah. I was thinking I'll probably make a new playlist on my channel with all of these delusional episodes too, and with that series we're doing on the Cambridge Companion to Postmodernism, because those are the only like series of videos that are on my channel so far.
hmm Well, speaking of which, I was thinking about this the other day. We could probably start a new series if we could ever get Mache, Drew, and Nick in the same podcast to maybe go over ideology.
That would be a great idea.
Yeah, because there's lots of good books out there in ideology, such as Terry Eagleton's from the early '90s. I did find one. It's a little bit more cognitive sciencey in its approach, but there's lots of stuff out there. And then we could like rope in Jonathan Haidt too.
Oh, of course. Yeah. If
Yes.
anyone who has watched any of my or any number of my videos knows that I'm a huge fan of Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah. So that's a side-ish idea. Maybe we could do that sometime.
For sure.
But we're continuing down our delusional path.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so let's dive right into David Hume. Now, David Hume is probably the most important figure in, quote, modern philosophy. He was a member of what they call the British empiricists. Actually, the third one, the ones that came before him were John Locke and George Berkeley. Hume was born in 1711, so he is squarely in the 18th century, and he is not just a philosopher, he is also very well known as a historian, because he did write a multi-volume history of England, which few people ever refer to, but in its day, it was one of the more authoritative histories of England.
Oh,
But
okay. I didn't know that.
yeah, and he wrote many essays on other different topics such as morality, politics, finance, even economics. But we're going to look at his philosophical contributions. Okay. So to set us up before we get to Deleuze, let's go ahead and do a quick run through of some of the main themes from Hume. So, as I said, Hume was an empiricist, and what does empiricism mean? This is all about experience, conscious experience, the experience of the senses, and so on. So, Locke and Berkeley were both empiricists, but they had a slightly different take. Locke believed that much of the knowledge came from the senses, but there was also innate ideas that were present in us from birth. That's where the tabula rasa came from too. But it's His approach was slightly different. And with Berkeley, we had to be is to be perceived. So this is an empirical idealism. To be is to be perceived, yet everything exists in the mind of God. Because
Was he the first person to coin that term, to be is to be perceived?
As far as I know, yes. The Latin
Oh,
is
okay.
esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
That, he's the one associated with the if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it exist?
Oh, okay.
Type of thought experiment. Yeah. So that's
Okay.
empirical idealism. And now we come to Hume, who is probably the most, at the far end of empiricists, and kind of takes it to its logical extreme. So,
Would he be what's classified as a radical empiricist?
yes, I would call him that.
Okay.
Okay, so the two main works that one studies when you get to Hume is the Treatise on Human Nature, which was his earlier work, and the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which was a revisitation or rewriting of the treatise, and it's shorter, and I guess it's designed more for a lay audience, you could say, because the treatise, as he said, fell dead, quote, fell dead born from the press, meaning that it went over like a lead balloon. Didn't really have the kind of impact he was hoping it made. So then he rewrote parts of it and produced the Inquiry, which had a slightly different reputation. But we'll go ahead and look at the treatise. So in the treatise, what Hume is trying to do is focusing on what is human nature. Okay. So it is an attempt to introduce the experimental method into moral subjects. And in his day, moral meant anything concerned with human nature, but not just ethics. He makes clear at the beginning of the first inquiry, moral philosophy is the science of human nature. Okay, so we won't get too much into moral philosophy at this point. So he studied the systems that came before him. He wasn't impressed and he wanted to do something about it. So this is where he took his empirical track. Now, some of the main themes that came from his project are the following. One is about the mind. Okay, so what he's trying to do in the treatise is also examine what is the mind, what is the nature of the human mind. So around this time, there was, the early modern period, there was the investigation of ideas of causation, moral good and evil, and everything other contested ideas. So there was an accepted theory of ideas. What is an idea? And by idea here, we're not talking about the Platonic idea, but rather the more philosophy of mind, cognitive science idea. I have an idea of fill in the blank. So what is that? What is the theory of ideas? Mental entities. And we have mental entities, but we don't necessarily have direct access to physical objects. So the empiricist version of this, everything we believe is ultimately traceable to experience. So this also includes things like supposedly transcendental type ideas like God. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So God could ultimately be traceable to experience. And we won't necessarily get into this, but Hume is also an atheist, a skeptic for obvious reasons. If you can't perceive something like God, which is a transcendental being, then why would you hold that it exists?
So,
That's not the radical empiricist approach.
so how come people like Locke, who were not atheists, if I understand correctly, were like, how come that's the case?
Well, because Locke was not a radical empiricist.
Okay.
The thing about the empiricist, unlike the rationalist, was that they did place the emphasis on perception,
Mm-hmm.
which, us who exist in the 21st century is like, well, of course that some of our knowledge derives from experience. How could you not think this way? But that wasn't necessarily the case way back in the day. Let's go all the way back to Plato. Plato would have begrudgingly had said that, yes, we derive some of our experience or some of our knowledge from experience, but it's not the ultimate type of knowledge. This is where episteme doxa comes in. So episteme is the knowledge of the true forms, the ideas, the eidos, but something that is from experience or even from a community of inquirers in experience is doxa, just kind of mere opinion. This is not the ultimate knowledge. But in the empiricist case, you're kind of doing away with the Platonic ideas and you're focusing more on empiricism. Now, going back to Locke again, is he admitted is that, yes, you do derive some of your knowledge from experience, but not entirely. This is where the innate ideas come in. He
Hmm.
was also a believer. Hume was not a believer.
Okay. I didn't
So if you,
realize that. I didn't realize that empiricism had been had been used to argue against God. I can't believe I didn't know that. That's
oh,
interesting.
sure. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, think of it. When you take your garden variety atheist who says, okay, so people say that this thing God exists. I don't see God. I don't experience God. Why would you hold that it exists if you can't see it, if you can't experience it? Okay. That's a simplification, of course. But yeah, why wouldn't it make sense if you're a radical
Yeah.
empiricist that you would do away with anything religious
Yeah.
or theological?
I guess I didn't I guess I didn't intuit that because I've heard people make basically empiricist arguments for the existence of God, but I
Right.
haven't heard the other way around so much.
Right. Yeah.
That's
Okay.
interesting.
Hmm. All right. So back to Hume. So he begins in the treatise with a kind of perceptions. Okay. So perceptions from the five senses. So any intelligible philosophical question must be asked and answered in those terms. A perception, in his definition, is any mental concept whatsoever, and he divides it into two separate categories: impressions and ideas. Okay, so an impression can include a sensation, as well as a desire, a passion, a feeling or a sentiment, and emotions. Okay, so then how it works is when you're perceiving something, you have an impression of X, the apple on my desk, the sun, fill in the blank of whatever it is. I have this impression, and then I have an idea. It's a faint image of that in thinking and reasoning. So first you have an impression, and then you have an idea from that. So if you have an idea of an apple, it resulted from when you first saw an apple, and when you saw the apple repeated in many different forms. So your strength of an idea comes in the fact that you perceived it many different times. That's basically what it is.
Okay.
Okay, makes sense so
Hmm.
far?
Yeah.
Okay.
So does he I don't remember, but does he get on to explaining um well, is it this concept that there are sort of innate ideas almost that explain why, like, how we would know? Well, I guess I'm sort of answering my own question as I'm talking here, but I was gonna say, how do we know what an apple is if we haven't seen one before? And then I guess I was thinking that someone explains it to us. And
Well,
then
yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's when you're talking about innate ideas, the the standard definition is something that already existed in the mind.
okay. So
It
like
didn't,
the idea of an apple already exists in your mind?
right? It already exists in the mind.
Okay.
It was something present in you from birth.
Okay.
But if you're taking the radical empiricist track, then you're like, okay, so you wouldn't believe in something called the innate idea.
Yeah.
It's rather repetition over the time. And yes, you probably at some point would have learned this thing that you're referring to. And I have an idea of this is what we call an apple in
Mhm.
English. In French, it would be called something different. In Swahili, it would be called something different. But the object itself, you had the original impression and repeated over time, but now you have this idea in your mind.
Okay.
Okay.
And I think we know more with modern science today that that brains are much more complex than that with their interaction with culture and stuff too. But
Yes.
that is an interesting insight.
Hmm. So then with impressions, Hume distinguishes two different kinds. One is the impression of a sensation or an original impression, and then an impression of reflection or a secondary one. So the impression of a sensation includes the feelings that you get from all five senses, as well as pains and pleasures. You whacked your head on a low overpass and you remember that sensation. And that they arise in us, what he says, quote, originally from unknown causes. Okay. And they are original because trying to determine the ultimate cause takes us beyond anything we can experience. and any intelligible investigation must stop with them. So he's not even bothering himself of what the original cause of this sensation is, this impression.
Okay.
Okay?
Mhm.
He says it's from an unknown cause, but it's original. So then an impression of reflection includes desires, emotions, passions, and sentiments. Okay? These are essentially reactions or responses to ideas, and they are secondary. So, for example, your memories of last year's sunburn are ideas, copies of original impressions you had when the sunburn occurred. And recalling those ideas, you to fear that you'll get another sunburn this year and to hope that you won't, and to want to take proper precautions to avoid overexposure to the sun. So, with fear, hope, and want, you already have desires, emotions, and sentiments that are wrapped up in that.
Oh, that's interesting. That makes
Okay.
me think about the concept of time too. And, what I hear philosophers talk about all the time, which is that your memories of things that happened in the past, those don't exist anymore other than in your memories because they already happened. And if you're anxious about something that happens in the future, then that doesn't exist either. It's just you making predictions of what's going to happen in the future.
Right. Now, the latter, the fear, that's an impression of reflection,
Yeah,
not
exactly.
not an impression of sensation, the original one.
Oh, okay.
So then Hume continues with perceptions, which are impressions and ideas. They could be either simple or complex. So complex impressions made up a group of simple impressions. Makes sense. So my impression of the violet I just picked is complex. Why? Because among the ways it affects my senses are its brilliant purple color and its sweet smell. I can separate and distinguish its color and smell from the rest of my impressions of the violet. Its color and smell are simple impressions, which can't be broken down further because they have no component parts. Okay?
Okay.
So then he continues. He distinguishes impressions and ideas in terms of the degree of force and vivacity. Okay. So impressions are more forceful and vivacious than ideas. Kind of makes sense. When you perceive something or if you feel something like the sunburn you had last year, this has more force and it has more vivacity. It's going to impact you a lot more than an idea of it is. You remember what happened last year, but it's not going to have the same intensity like you did when you first experienced it.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I
So
see what that means. Yeah.
yeah, so my impression of this ripe tomato's bright red color is as vivid as anything could be. I'm perceiving it right then and there. Last year's tomatoes were just as vivid when I was looking at them, but now my idea of them is much less vivid than my impressions of the tomato in front of me. Okay. Since last year's tomatoes were the same color, the difference can't be that they are different shades of red. The difference must be in the sharpness, clarity, and brightness of my impressions, their force and vivacity. Kind of makes sense. You can remember tomatoes that you had seen last year, but you don't have the same kind of, um, it doesn't strike you as much as it does with the tomato you're looking at right now.
Right. This
Okay.
is all just a lot of this so far is making me almost think that Hume is trying to get people to think about empiricism as mindfulness in a way. That's like the impression I get from him talking about these ideas so far. I don't know if that's just the stoner impression I have, but
I think it might
yeah.
be the stoner impression.
Is it?
I think so.
I'm not saying he's trying to do that deliberately. I'm just thinking. I've heard other philosophers talk about these subjects in this ways those sorts of ways before, and it makes me think about it. But yeah,
Mm,
I could be way off base.
hmm I think we need some chemical substances to help with that discussion. But we'll save that for another time.
Okay.
Okay. So when Hume distinguishes impressions and ideas in terms of their relative force and vivacity, he's pointing out something that is generally true of them as a matter of fact. On occasion, in dreams or a high fever, ideas may approach the force and vivacity of impressions, but these are exceptions that prove the empirical rule. In general, impressions and ideas are so different that no one can know the distinction. That's an important point. You could experience the idea as much more forceful than the impression, but only in certain cases.
So, what would some of those cases be?
So, he mentions about a high fever or in a dream. Everybody dreams. And so there has to be at least one time in your life when you had such a vivid dream that you thought it was real.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So that's one occasion where an idea has more forcefulness than an impression. But generally speaking, impressions have more force than an idea does.
Hmm.
Okay.
Wouldn't they almost be like wouldn't they almost be equal in a sense? Because when you're experiencing that dream,
Hmm.
I think you probably don't know, like you can't imagine anything more forceful, but then your memory could be just as vivid, especially like just after you wake up or something like that.
Yes. Now, an additional difficulty with that, which we're not going to get into now, is that dreams oftentimes don't necessarily refer to anything that exists in reality.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So, although that's one occasion, according to Hume, where you feel the intensity of an idea much more than you do an impression, whereas vice versa is usually the case, where did the dream come from? Okay. Now, I think later on he says about with the ideas, you can then combine them in such a way to create things, other images, or to come to an understanding of certain things like causality, which we're going to get to in a minute. Okay, so then he continues. Although nothing seems freer than the power of thought, it's not restrained within limits of nature and reality. The imagination, is in fact confined within very narrow limits. We can separate and combine our ideas in new and even bizarre ways. I just said this. Imagining creatures we've never seen or faraway galaxies, but all the materials of thinking are ultimately derived from our impressions. Since, quote, all our ideas or more feeble perceptions are copies of our impressions or more lively ones. We are restricted to, quote, compounding, transporting, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded us by the senses and experience. So, although it is possible you can combine ideas in many novel different ways, ultimately they come from impressions, which makes you wonder because if you're thinking about galaxies, let's go into astrophysics here. If you're thinking about galaxies, where did you ever perceive a galaxy except in a photo, or maybe
Yeah.
reading about it, or watching a documentary, or something like that? Now, remember, Hume is writing in the 18th century, where the kind of media that we take for granted didn't exist at the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you bearing that in mind, I mean, like with all that anyone can learn about astrophysics now, like the sheer number of stars in our galaxy alone, the sheer number of galaxies, the sheer number of stars in those galaxies, those numbers get too large for the human mind to even comprehend. And like they're such bizarre things like black holes too. And then I
Mhm.
was also just thinking when you were describing Hume's thoughts on that is a possibility that even these bizarre things are just based on the concepts of ideas that we have in the first place, or at least maybe our interpretations do. But I was thinking also, like anyone who's used any psychedelic drugs before probably would beg to differ because I don't
I'm
think
sure
that
you have a lot to say about that too, Andrew.
I have at least a little bit to say about that, but
Okay.
like the stories that people tell of the bizarre stuff that you could that it seems almost impossible to imagine
Hmm.
is is interesting in terms of this idea.
Yes. Yes. The Humean idea.
Yeah.
Okay. So pressing on, we'll get to another major topic here is the principle of association, or principles. So Hume says, quote, there is a secret tie or union among particular ideas, which causes the mind to conjoin them more frequently, and makes the one, upon its appearance, induce the other. Okay. So this tie or union is the mind's natural ability to associate certain ideas. But this is not an inseparable connection. Rather, it's as he says, quote, a gentle force which commonly prevails, by means of which one idea naturally introduces another. Okay. And there are three principles of association. One is resemblance, another one is contiguity in time and place, and the last one is causation. So, when someone shows you a picture of your best friend, you naturally think of her because the picture resembles her. That's the first principle. When you're reminded of something that happened in the 1960s, miniskirts, for example, you may think of the Vietnam War because they are temporally contiguous. That's the second association. Thinking of Sausalito, California, may lead you to think of the Golden Gate Bridge, which may lead you to think of San Francisco, since they are spatially contiguous.
So what does contiguous mean? Does it mean like related or something like that?
Occupying the same place or the same timeline.
Okay.
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 So as he's saying is that, miniskirts in the Vietnam War, they are temporally contiguous, meaning in the 1960s, miniskirts made an appearance, and then the Vietnam War also happened at that time. Happened in the same timeline.
I wonder what that was like too. Of course, my mind just jumped to what it would have been like when women first started wearing miniskirts. Bet that was a great time.
I bet, yeah. I wasn't around then.
Yeah,
There was
I
an
wasn't
echo of it
either.
in the 70s, but I was too young to remember.
Oh, okay.
Okay, and so the last one, causality works from both cause to effect and effect to cause. Meeting someone's father may make you think of his son. Encountering the son may lead you to thoughts of his father. Of the three associative principles, again, a resemblance, contiguity in time and place, and causation, causation is the strongest and the only one that takes us beyond our senses, according to Hume. It establishes links between our present and past experiences and our expectations about the future, so that, Hume, quote, all reasonings concerning matters of fact seem to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. So, for example, taking aspirin in the past has relieved my headaches. So I expect that the aspirin I just took will soon relieve my present headache. Hume also makes clear that causation is the least understood of the associative principles, but he tells us, quote, we shall have occasion afterwards to examine it to the bottom. Okay?
Okay. So
Continuing.
that's like the classic modern scientific rationalist approach, like every effect has a cause, basically.
Right. Every effect has a cause.
Yeah.
Okay. So then with the associative principles or in general, they are original. They can't be explained further. And Hume also does not try to explain why we associate ideas as we do. He's not interested in the why. Only in establishing that as a matter of fact, we do associate ideas in this way. Okay?
So he's just interested in the how?
Right. The operation of the mind. So he
Okay.
says that the human mind operates by association, of which there are three. Again,
Right.
resemblance, contiguity in time and place, and causation. Now,
Yeah.
causation itself, again, is the most important here because, let's see, where could we go here? So, just going to go ahead and read this. Modern philosophers thought of themselves as scientific revolutionaries because they rejected Aristotle's account of causation, modern meaning around Hume's time. Even so, they accepted his distinction between knowledge and belief and regarded causal inference as an exercise of reason, which aimed at demonstrating the necessary connection between cause and effect. So even as far back as Aristotle, this was something that reason did, not that it actually objectively existed, causation.
Right.
Okay. Malebranche and others following Descartes were optimistic about the possibility of demonstrative scientific knowledge, while those in the British experimental tradition, of which he was a part, were more pessimistic. Locke was sufficiently skeptical about what knowledge we can attain that could be constructed one of the first accounts of probable inference to show that belief can meet standards of rationality that make experimental natural philosophy intellectually respectable. Okay.
Oh,
So
okay.
there was the experimental strain in the British empiricists, which kind of exists to this day. You even see this in Anglo-American analytic philosophy, or so-called, very much in the experimental tradition. Okay, so Propositions concerning relations of ideas are intuitively or demonstratively certain. They are known a priori, which means prior to experience, discoverable independently of experience by the mere operation of thought, so that their truth doesn't depend on anything actually existing. Okay, for example, that the interior angles of a Euclidean triangle sum to 180 degrees is true whether or not there are any Euclidean triangles to be found in nature. We've kind of seen this already. Denying that proposition is a contradiction, just as it is contradictory to say that 8 times 7 is 57. But the truth of propositions concerning matters of fact depends on the way the world is. Their contraries are always possible. Their denials never imply contradictions, and they can't be established by demonstration. For example, asserting that Miami is north of Boston is false, but not contradictory. We can understand that someone who asserts this, we can understand what someone who asserts this is saying, even if we are puzzled about how he could have had the facts so wrong. Now, an interesting sideline to this is there's been quite a lot written within recent decades about fictional entities or fictional descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's a separate issue. So, continuing on, getting to causal inference. So causal inferences are the only way we can go beyond the evidence of our senses and memories. In making them, we suppose that there is some connection between present facts and what we infer from them. But what is this connection and how is it established? If the connection is established by an operation of reason or the understanding, it must concern either relations of ideas or matters of fact. Okay. Then Hume argues that the connection, causal inference, cannot involve relations of ideas. Effects are different events from their causes, so there is no contradiction in conceiving of a cause occurring and its usual effect not occurring. Ordinary causal judgments are so familiar that we tend to overlook this. They seem immediate and intuitive. But suppose you were suddenly brought into the world as an adult, armed with the intellectual firepower of an Einstein. Could you simply by examining an aspirin tablet determine that it will relieve your headache? Good point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when we reason a priori, we consider the idea of the object we regard as a cause independently of any observations we have made of it. It can include the idea of any other distinct object, including the object we take to be its usual effect. But then it can't show us any, quote, inseparable and unviable connection, Hume's words, any necessary connection between those ideas. So the upshot of this is when we're talking about causation or causal inference, causation is a concept. It's something that reason or the understanding applies to a series of events. When you say that A causes B or B causes C and so on. But the inference that we're inferring that because we saw A and it seemed to cause B, like in the case of aspirin, when I took the aspirin, it relieved me of my headache. So I say that the aspirin relieved my headache. But the difficulty here is that we're talking about two separate events, and then we're inferring a cause that exists between the two. But there's no necessary connection here. And this is
Yeah.
what Hume is getting at.
This is exactly what I don't remember whether we talked about this on the podcast before or we were just messaging each other and talking about philosophy of mind. And we were talking about Skinner's idea of behaviorism and the idea of stimulus and response. It's similar to the idea of cause and effect. And where Noam Chomsky criticizes it by saying that exactly what you were describing there, basically, like you don't know whether when you're observing a response to a stimulus, whether that is a response to the stimulus that you think it is, or maybe it's a different stimulus, or maybe the response is actually the stimulus, and you don't really know for sure, like you're saying.
Right. So another kind of pedestrian example that you sometimes see is when you're talking about a pool table. You take your cue stick and you hit the cue ball and you sink the 8 ball in the corner pocket. So you say that I caused the 8 ball to go into the corner pocket.
Mm-hmm.
You did. Actually, you could break this down as that I moved my hand, the cue stick hit the cue ball hit the 8 ball, and the 8 ball went into the side pocket. I say that I caused it, or that the cue ball caused the 8 ball to go into the side pocket.
Right.
But there are, again, two separate events, actually three separate events here. My arm moves, the cue strikes the cue ball, the cue ball strikes the 8 ball. So there's no necessary connection among the three.
Yeah.
However,
Exactly.
this is what and Hume uses the word habit here. By habit, this is what we assume is the case. We infer this kind of causality that exists.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. But again, there is no necessary connection among the three events.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, as a side note, you know the statement about correlation does not imply causation.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So that's also something to keep in mind. I don't
Yeah.
know. I have. It's been a long time since I last read Hume. I don't know if that's an insight that you took from Hume. Correlation does not imply causation. That's an
Yeah.
important thing to keep in mind.
Definitely.
Okay, so that's
And people easily make that mistake all the time. Like it's almost like you're going to do that at least a handful of times every now and then if you're a human, basically.
sure. And it's something we do because we don't have the time and we don't have the energy to really break things down.
Yeah.
We
Not
can
like literally every single thing. Like
right, and
sometimes
this
you have to pick your battles, basically.
right, and this is where it's important to make the distinction. You know, this is a classic philosophical distinction between deduction and inference. Deduction follows by rules,
Yeah.
logical rules, whereas inference is you fill in the gaps that something happened.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
scientists proceed by inference all the time. That's kind of what the hallmark of of the philosophy of science is. What is your theory of inference? Not deduction. What's your theory of inference?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. So that's all the prep work I'm going to do for Hume because I'd like to dig into what Deleuze has to say about him, and in particular about Hume's concept of the self, which is extremely important here.
Okay.
Okay. So the book where Deleuze treats of Hume is called Empiricism and Subjectivity, and this is his earliest monograph. It came out in 1956.
Oh, okay.
And a bit of the background is that this was unusual at the time because in French academic philosophy, they very much stressed the history of philosophy, but they kind of gave short shrift to the British empiricists. Rather, Descartes was there, and Leibniz was there, and Aristotle, of course, and Plato, of course, and all the other cats, but not so much on the British empiricism, curiously enough. And Deleuze was one of the few at the time who really took an active interest in Hume. Okay, so we'll start off with a quote from Empiricism and Subjectivity. Deleuze says, quote, "The classical definition of empiricism proposed by the Kantian tradition is this. Empiricism is the theory according to which knowledge not only begins with experience, but is derived from it. But why would the empirist say that? And as the result of which question? This definition, to be sure, has the advantage, at least, of avoiding a piece of nonsense. Were empiricism to be defined simply as the theory according to which knowledge begins only with experience, there would not have been any philosophy or philosophers, Plato and Leibniz included, who would not be empiricists. The fact is, though, that the definition is in no way satisfactory. In short, it seems impossible to define empiricism as a theory according to which knowledge derives from experience." End quote. Okay, so a somewhat standard definition of empiricism is that knowledge derives from experience. However, as Deleuze underscores here, or it's almost an implication, is that not all knowledge derives from experience, even though one may call oneself an empiricist.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of what I was just thinking, actually.
Yeah. So I'd already said is that with Locke, Locke believed, propounded innate ideas. Hume did not. However, as we saw in a bit of the prep material, is that where do the associations come from? The associations are the operations of the mind.
Hmm.
But are the associations or this, or you could even say the laws of the mind, something that you derive from experience itself? Hard to say at this point, but we're not going to get into the fine details of Hume's philosophy. Again, we're
Could
focusing on Deleuze.
you clarify what what he means by by experience? Does he mean like human consciousness from an anthropomorphic perspective, or does he mean like experiences in including the entire universe?
No, the five senses.
Oh, okay. Oh, right, right. You mentioned that.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
the five senses.
So it is just this like human consciousness level of understanding.
But Hume did not say anything about consciousness. Remember that.
Okay.
When you're talking about empiricism, yes, you could say that our conscious experience, but that's something of a later notion. Back in the day, when you say that you're an empiricist, you're focusing on the five senses.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, if you take that to a logical extreme, you could even deny consciousness. Nobody's been able to define consciousness yet, and that's a separate issue.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. There's tons of debate about whether, like, what consciousness is, whether we actually are consciousness, all those sorts of topics,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so pressing on. Now, I said in the prep material is that what Hume's goal was in the Treatise of Human Nature was to define what human nature is. Deleuze says, quote, "The question that will preoccupy Hume is this: how does the mind become human nature?" Okay, so that's the preparatory question here. Okay, so in the prep material, I made the distinction between impressions and ideas. So in the essay, which we're in Deleuze's philosophical lineage here, instead of focusing on the impression-idea relationship, Deleuze is interested in the emerging system, the subject itself, which provides the internal rules for the organization of the chaos which natively exists within the mind. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. I had said before about Hume defines the association, the operation of the mind. Okay, so now what Deleuze is kind of interested in answering this question: from when does this arise? The subject, okay, which is an emerging system in his definition, his take on it.
Okay.
So continuing, the brief answer to the question, how is the subject constituted within the given, meaning the empirically given, is that the principles of human nature give order, regularity, and purpose to the chaos of associations, and that through this organization, the subject emerges as an active part of the organization itself. Elaborating on Hume's analogy of the mind as a percussive instrument, Deleuze writes, quote, "The subject must be compared to the resonance and the increasingly louder reverberation of principles within the depths of the mind. At the same time, this movement is one that involves a transition from passive to active, or rather the emergence of an active subject under the influence of the principles. Quote, the subject is an imprint or an impression left by principles. It progressively turns into a machine capable of using this impression." Okay,
Okay.
makes sense so far?
Yeah. Yeah, I think
All
so.
right. So let me go ahead and unpack this a bit. So if we're talking about empirical experience, it is a flux
Yeah.
when you get right down to it. Now, the interesting question is, we have five senses, and as we know from contemporary science, is that some experiences are actually two of the senses. For example, taste. Taste is a combination of also has a combination of smell. You don't taste something unless your smell is working properly. Okay,
Right.
but the main thing here is that sensory experience is chaotic. It all comes in at once. So how is it possible for us to distinguish sensory experience in the human sense of the impressions? How are we able to do this? Now, if you go back to Aristotle, his notion of, in Latin, what they called the sensus communis, the common sense, which is something that binds, that ties all of the disparate senses together. This is not common sense, is what people usually refer to as a use your common sense, dumbass. It is this operating principle that gives form, gives shape to all of the chaotic impressions that we have through the senses. Okay, and so we're talking about Hume. This is an upgrade, sort of. So then, what gives rise to this? Well, the subject is what gives rise to it's the organizing principle, but it emerges from the flux. Okay, and human nature is what gives order, regularity, and purpose to the chaos of associations that one experiences in the human mind. And through the organization, the subject is what emerges too. Okay, makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so continuing. The principles of association are what provide the elementary structure of the subject by providing constancy to the fleeting and ungoverned associations in the mind. And remember, the three main associations are resemblance, contiguity in time and space, and causation.
Yeah, those make
From,
sense.
from the collection of impressions which are associated indifferently and asystematically, the subject begins to emerge as a self-governing system of tendencies. Okay, keep that in mind. So, here's a quote from Deleuze, quote, "If it is true that the principles of association shape the mind by imposing on it a nature that disciplines the delirium or the fictions of the imagination, conversely, the imagination uses these same principles to make its fictions or its fantasies acceptable and to give them a warrant they wouldn't have on their own. In this sense, it belongs to fiction to feign these relations, to induce fictive ones, and to make us believe in our follies." End quote. So, continuing in the essay, the entirely unavoidable problem here is the following. Given that the consistency and structure of the mind is a fiction, produced not on the basis of a correspondence with the world, but rather according to the application of principles to the variety of experience, it follows that the consistency and structure thus produced tend towards fictional applications. The easy transition that the principles create from one idea to another is equally in the service of legitimate and illegitimate associations. In other words, the constituted subject is not constituted around a principle of truth, but around a principle of order. And some of the consequences sanctioned by this order are, properly speaking, products. To put the matter in the Kantian form that Deleuze often uses, the principles of association are illegitimate and excessive. They go too far and sanctify too many things.
Because of that tendency to be more useful for fiction, like you mentioned at that one point.
Well, not that it's more useful for fiction. It is a fiction.
That yeah. That
Okay,
it is a
so
fiction. Yeah.
so what he's getting at is, and this goes going back to Hume, also with the operations of the mind, the impressions of ideas, causal inference, there also is a great discussion about what the self is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Hume did not believe there was such a thing as the self because, paraphrasing, he says, when I turn upon myself, I look for this thing called the self and I can't find it.
Yeah.
So there's no such thing as an essential existing self within the subject, the human being. Okay, this self is a concept, an operation of the mind, whatever it is you want to call it. Now, Deleuze's reading of this, and again, he's doing an idiosyncratic reading of Hume, is that the operations of the mind through association, which is what gives order to the chaos of what perception is, also at the same time is creating the subject that is perceiving.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when we're saying I perceive such and such, the I, which is our subject, is also a creation of our mind.
Yeah, of course. It doesn't, we're only, like, it only exists because, well, we invented it. It doesn't actually exist. We think it exists because we invented the concept.
Right. Now, to fast forward a bit when you get to Kant, which incidentally is going to be the next essay in this book, one insight that Kant came up with is that the I, the transcendental, or rather, hold on. So the I, when you're talking about the I think, what is this I? This I is not a substance that thinks. At best, it's probably a grammatical construction. And I is a subject pronoun in English. So this I is what kind of gives order to a subject that is thinking, a subject that is doing X, Y, and Z. But it's not a substance. If you think about it as a substance, then you've already gone beyond the boundaries of reason. And then it
Yeah.
becomes something that we use the words illegitimate and excessive. It's going too far.
Yeah.
Okay.
Man, the world would be so different if we didn't even have this concept, if language were constructed around like the complex interconnectedness of factors that contribute to every single thing that happens, or something
Right.
like that.
Right. Now, of course, I took great pains to stress this when I was doing the podcast on postmodernism with James last year, is that particularly when you're talking about postmodernists or even post-structuralists, better post-structuralists, is that they refer to it as the subject rather than the self or the person. When you refer to it as the subject, then you're avoiding lots of the baggage that comes with referring to something as a self or referring to something as a person, human being even.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So, again, to recap is, again, what Hume is trying to do in the treatise is give a definition of human nature with the operations of the mind. The mind, with its operations by association, is bringing order to the chaos of perception, but at the same time is creating that subject. Okay.
Yeah.
So, continuing on. All right. Okay, so now we're getting to reason here. So, reason is the subjective capacity engendered by the principles themselves to reflect on and critique the beliefs that constitute the subject in accordance with the principles. This is both its proper strength and the source of its ultimate futility. Only reason has the unconcerned and passionless point of view to present such a critique, aligning it with the, quote, strict calculus of probabilities, a probabilistic analysis of the likelihood of particular fictions in relation to the more general schema of association, and the correction of deviations from this norm. This, however, is all that it can do, having no other strength or mandate. Okay, so in other words, reason provides the boundaries.
Except if we go back to Jonathan Haidt, who we mentioned earlier, and again, you did mention that this is being written in the 1800s, so we should bear that in mind. But
1700s.
1700s. Sorry,
Yes.
sorry. I thought you said 1800s.
Mhm.
But what we learned from Jonathan Haidt is that what we think is reason is really inexorably linked to intuition and emotion. So it's our like this reason boundary is basically really an intuitive boundary that we rationalize about, which is not as disparaging as I'm trying to make it sound, just a more complex understanding of it.
Right. Reason is only one component in the operations of the mind.
Yeah,
However, reason itself has, again, referring to Kant here, is when in the first critique, the critique of pure reason, what he's doing, his main project, is to use the principles of reason to critique reason itself.
yeah, yeah, that makes me really want to read that. That's one of many ones that I really want to check out, like right now.
Yeah. Okay. So continuing on, that's about reason. Right. So if reason is the developed capacity to examine and critique the ways in which beliefs relate to our experience of the world, it is developed according to the same processes that presented with problematic instances in need of such critique. For Hume, it is not the sleep of reason which engenders monsters in the mind. Fire dragons, winged horses, and monstrous giants, to quote Hume. These monsters pre-exist reason and are given renewed legitimacy by the same principles that lend force to reason itself. This is the first sense in which reason is presented as a weak or auxiliary capacity in Hume's account. The second, as we will now see, concerns the role of the passions in relation to reason. Okay, so unlike with what the rationalists, to use an example, would have to say, reason is not paramount. And as the best, it's a weaker auxiliary capacity, something
Yeah,
that provides with the boundaries. Okay,
yeah,
so continuing on, where association constructs relations between ideas, relative causes and effects, what is provided by the passions are the weighing of these relations with respect to means and ends, And just as a side note, the passion is more or less a synonym for emotions. Okay?
Right.
Where the principles of association render the subject consistent, the principles of the passions render it moral. Qualitative distinction is added to quantitative order, providing a capacity for the distinction between causes in terms of a goal. We thus comprehend Hume's famous assertion that reason is the slave of the passions, famous line, that, quote, reason alone can never be a motive to any action of the will. And what Deleuze indicates is the single most important sentiment in Hume's philosophy, also a famous quote, which is, quote, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger."
Oh, wow. That's a great quote.
Hmm. But the better known one is reason is a slave to the passions.
Yeah.
Okay. So reason is at best handmaiden and auxiliary, but its passions is what the motivating factor is.
Right.
Okay. Now, in recent years, there have been some philosophers, psychologists, cognitive science, or whatever it is, who are reaffirming what Hume had to say, that we're not rational animals like we think we are.
Mhm.
Rather, we act upon emotions, passions, whatever it is, and then provide a justification for what that action was.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, like, Hume basically had it right long before Jonathan Haidt.
Or others.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so the quote about "'tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." So one way to read that is reason can get caught up in abstractions. Okay. So if reason says it makes sense that you destroy the whole world, you do it. But that doesn't mean the passions follow along, because reason is not concerned with means or ends, only with really abstractions and providing the boundaries or the justification, as we said, for whatever the passions had in mind.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
so continuing. More importantly, however, the principles of the passions provide the practical, or what amounts to the same thing, institutional solution to the problem of the excessive application of the principles of association. While, as we have seen, the reflective or corrective use of these principles is of limited capacity, the principles of the passions form the moral and political framework in which the extended use of the associations can be framed, evaluated, and judged. Something I forgot to mention is that also another project that Hume had in the Treatise and then Inquiries is providing the theoretical framework for moral philosophy, which is not ethics, moral philosophy.
Oh, I honestly didn't even realize there's a difference, even though I've read tons of moral philosophy and ethics.
Well, but again, remember Hume's time period. Okay, so moral philosophy is what you would hear more commonly talked about, and moral philosophy can be a grab bag of many different things. Some of it are related to politics. Politics could be subsumed in moral philosophy.
Oh, that certainly happens all the time.
Yes. So repeat this. While, as we have seen, the reflective or corrective use of these principles is of limited capacity, the principles of the passions form the moral and political framework in which the extended use of the associations can be framed, evaluated, and judged. This is why Deleuze claims, in a key moment of the text, that, quote, "the problem of the self, insoluble at the level of the understanding, finds, uniquely within culture, a moral and political solution. The principles of the passions thus provide a necessary correlate to the principles of association by orienting them and limiting them according to our social investments." Or as Deleuze puts it, quote, "Association gives the subject a possible structure, but only the passions can give it being and existence. In its relation to the passions, association finds its sense and its destiny. In turn, reason itself, as the corrective moment of the principles of association, finds its ground in the passions. This is why, quote, reason can always be brought to bear, but it is brought to bear on a pre existing world and presupposes an antecedent ethics and an order of ends." Okay, so in other words, association is the operation of the mind. The self or the subject emerges from the operations in association. Okay, association gives it its structure, but the passions give it being and existence.
That
And
makes
reason
sense.
itself as the corrective element finds its ground in the passions. So the passions deal with means and ends. The association, operations of association, give rise to the subject. And the subject is concerned with an order, an antecedent ethics, and an order of ends. So we're not talking about reason being prior to, it comes after.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So definitely Hume, through Deleuze's reading, provides a very interesting take on things. Reason, or the rational subject, you could say, is not prior to, it comes afterwards.
Yeah,
Before you have ethics and an order of ends, which derive from the passions.
yeah, exactly.
So we, as a subject, are motivated by the passions. We want certain things. We have means and ends provided. We, through the operations of our minds, constitute ourselves as a subject. And then moral philosophy is what gives us the impetus to achieve those ends.
Yep,
Okay?
yep. So our basically like we moralize and rationalize our passions and we go from there.
Yes. Yes. Okay?
Yep.
So pressing on. It is through my sympathy with others who are like me, here we see one role play by resemblance in Hume's thought, that I can express, quote, the desire for the pleasure of the other, capital O, and an aversion to his or her pain. However, my sympathy for others is naturally limited, since it is partial, leaving us with less than the universality implied by the ideas of justice and fairness. This is why Deleuze will claim that, quote, society is in the beginning a collection of families, even though, quote, all the elements of morality, sympathies, are naturally given. They are impotent by themselves to constitute a moral world.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. So the elements of morality, by a slight extension, you could even say ethics, cannot constitute what a moral world is. It falls far short of that.
So what is needed to complete the whole project?
Well, that's a good question. Maybe we'll see this later on.
Yeah. I
Okay.
don't think there's an answer to that question personally.
Well, let's see. So continuing on, the whole moral world, or the system of extended means, is literally created through the continued activity of the principles. This system is entirely fabricated. It is literally unnatural. The reality of the moral world, quote, is not natural, it is artificial. The moral world is rich and complex, and Deleuze demonstrates how Hume can present a rich theory of not just politics traditionally understood, but of property, conversation, commerce, taste, taxation, and so forth, all on the basis of the extension of sympathy through the creative moment of the principles of the passions. Quote, this is Deleuze. True morality does not involve the change of human nature, but the invention of artificial and objective conditions in order for the bad, which is to say partial, limited, aspects of this nature not to triumph.
Okay.
Okay? So, kind of makes sense to us. We've kind of heard this before, is that when you're talking about things like property, conversation, commerce, taste, and so on, these are kind of abstractions. They don't
Yeah.
exist independently in the world at large.
Yeah, we socially constructed them.
Right. And then true morality is actually preventative.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay.
That's interesting.
It's not when you're moralizing to somebody. Let's take the verb moralizing. You're not trying to get them to change their nature, but you're preventing them from doing X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. Well,
Exhorting them not to do X, Y, and Z.
yeah, exactly. Like if you look at it psychologically, if you're just talking so that you can take the moral high ground over someone or over some group or something, you're not going to convince anyone because you're just being condescending to them.
Yeah, and people are not convinced necessarily by a rational argument.
Yeah, exactly.
Because, as we've already seen from Hume, is that reason is a slave to the passions.
Yeah,
I want what I want, and you're not going to stand in my way, you son of a bitch.
exactly. Yeah, so that's why people like we identify with our opinions because because they come from our passions.
Yes. Okay. Hmm. Okay, so there is here a definition, Deleuze's definition of an institution. So, quote, this is a model of the personal and the social. Deleuze says, the institution, unlike the law, is not a limitation, but rather a model of actions, a veritable enterprise, an invented system of positive means or a positive invention of indirect means. This conception of the institution effectively reverses the problem. Outside of the social, there lies the negative, lack or need. The social is profoundly creative, inventive, and positive. And so the essay continues. Just like the possibility of a rigorous psychology, the possibility of morality, sociology, and politics rests on the creative activity of the principles, which themselves work on the delirious maelstrom of the undisciplined imagination.
That makes sense.
Okay. Moving right along. Let's see. How much more could I do of this? All right. So continuing on, page, what is it? 74. That's where we're at. On Hume's thought and Deleuze. I think I might have skipped some of my notes here.
I highlighted that section in my notes too.
Okay, we can just go by your notes.
Okay,
So you go ahead and I can answer any questions.
sure. Hume's thought in Deleuze. At issue once more is the constitution of a certain form of subjectivity undergirded by a synthetic moment which is not the act of this subject. However, what is completely absent is any reference to Hume's principles. These will be replaced in the final analysis with Deleuze's retooled version of the Kantian idea, and consequently, the models of reverberation and complication of the principles in establishing the rich world of the subject and the object will be replaced with the theme of contemplation, and more profoundly, with the sweeping drama of what Deleuze comes to call indidrama differentiation, I think is how you pronounce that.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of hyphens and slashes in there.
Yes, it does.
Okay, so yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that part.
Yeah. So what I take from that is the thing about subjectivity. So the brilliant insight about Hume is there is no such thing as self.
Yeah.
As an essence.
Yeah.
There just isn't. However, we often say that there is such a thing as self. I mean, again, this reminds me of the concept of anatta in Buddhism. So anatta is the Pali of the anatman. Atman is like the self or the soul in Hindu religion. And so anatta is a no self. However, make a key distinction here. Anatta does not mean that there's no self, rather that there is a conventional understanding or a concept of a self that doesn't persist, that it's not infinite.
Okay.
Okay. So applying the same insight to Hume here is that empirically no such thing as a self. But Deleuze's reading says that with the subject, and he's not using the self, he's using the term subject here, the subject is constituted from the operations of association in the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is where that subjectivity comes from. What the thing about the retooled version of the Kantian idea, well, the idea, it was the capital I, instead of the Platonic idea. The Kantian idea is a notion that is innate. Now, we'll see this a little bit more when we get to Kant, because Deleuze treats Kant as the enemy. You remember what I said at the very beginning where we were going over Plato, is that some philosophers are allies and others are enemies.
Mm-hmm.
But but Deleuze is trying to do with the enemy is really get inside the philosophy and use it to his own ends, subvert it.
Right. Right.
Okay. So the models of reverberation, complication, principle establishing a rich world, the subject and object. Okay, so no strict distinction here between a subject and object. Rather, indi-drama differentiation. Okay, this goes back to an earlier point with the difference. Between two subjects, there is a difference. What is difference? Difference is primary instead of identity.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Continue.
That's the only part I had down for my notes in that section.
Okay. Let's see.
So wait, so what you just said, his him talking about difference, which is a huge part of Deleuze. That's
Right.
what he means by that drama differentiation, that term.
Yeah, I mean, the way of looking at that, just to go over it once again, when you're talking about subject and object, that's a dualist approach.
Yeah.
There is a subject, there is an object. The two are not the same. One is perceiving or experiencing the other, and the one is influencing the other. Strict division here.
Right.
Deleuze gets away from that, as we already saw in his treatments of identity. Identity emerges from difference. It's not prior to differences, as it's traditionally been understood.
Mm-hmm.
So with differentiation, there's that. The drama is, some kind of operation, like a drama in terms of a theater play. I think he's getting to that. And indi referring to the individuation. Remember when we looked at Duns Scotus about individuation, the medieval understanding of that?
Yes.
Okay. So that's what I take as the indi drama differentiation.
Okay.
It's kind of a mouthful. I think he could have said it more simply.
Yeah, well, that's Deleuze.
That's Deleuze. That's right. He's delusional.
Yep.
All right. Let's see. All right. So on the same page, transcendental empiricism. Yes. So that is a term most closely identified with Deleuze. So as Joffe
I
says,
didn't know that.
Yeah, so as Joffe says in the essay, it's not a descendant of Hume's philosophy in any conventional sense. Okay. But there are 6 issues that each of these treats, and we can go through these quickly. So the first one is the critique of negativity. Okay. So, all right. The position elucidated in difference and repetition is paradigmatic, that the negative is only the epiphenomenon of actualized difference, an inevitable transcendental illusion, that by taking the negative as the fundamental, we in fact invert our grasp on the world, animating a shadow play which robs us of the thought of difference. Okay, so instead of taking negativity as the starting off point, okay, it's only something that emerges. An epiphenomenon is something that just emerges from, as early philosophy of mind is that the mind is an epiphenomenon of brain activity, for example. So negativity is an epiphenomenon of actualized difference. There really is no such thing in Deleuze's treatment of there is the positive and that's the negative. It's all difference.
Okay.
It's a transcendental illusion. Okay.
Okay.
So there's that. Next is the figure of the institution, which we already defined above. The institution names in Hume the inventive aspect of culture as such. So instead of the law, it is the institution. It forms a society very strong. The essence of society is not the law, but rather the institution. Okay.
that makes sense.
Yep. All right. So then another one. Relations are external to their terms. Okay. This claim is championed in each of Deleuze's treatments of Hume. The striking and the strongest and most striking formulation is perhaps the following, quote, "We will call non-empiricist every theory according to which, in one way or another, relations are derived from the nature of things," end quote. It is particularly striking in comparison with the use to which Deleuze puts this theme later, and particularly in difference of repetition. For there, this arch-empiricist theme finds a supreme instance in a metaphysical reading of the differential calculus. Okay, the calculus is a pure relation even though respective values are zero. All right, so relations are external to their terms. Yeah, I guess that's a way to read it. Okay, next one. The danger for thought within thinking. Okay. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze presents a brief history of accounts of error in thinking, beginning with Descartes and Plato. In these figures, external or empirical factors are involved to explain the possibility that thought might go astray. Okay. However, in Kant, a quite different possibility exists, namely illusion, a threat internal to thinking as such. Okay. So in the case of Descartes, for example, you've heard of the evil demon, correct?
I'm not sure that I have actually.
Okay. So when you're reading the Meditations, Descartes is going through the methodological doubt. How do I come to know anything? Then he arrives that of the three innate ideas, the first of which is God, there is a God. Number two, there is the cogito, I know that I am a thinking thing,
Right.
and that there's a res extensa, that objects in the external world have an extension to them. This is a 17th late scholastic type of idea that objects have extension. Okay, these are the three innate ideas. But Descartes says, I could be deceived by an evil demon. And so this evil demon is something external to what's going on with Descartes' doubt or thinking processes. Make sense?
Yeah.
That's what he means by external. But when you get to Kant, there is illusion, which exists within reason when it, again, reason critiquing reason. When you go beyond where it becomes illegitimate, you run into illusions. So that is something that's internal.
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
that makes sense.
All right. Yeah, the danger for thought within thinking.
Yeah.
Right. So the rules constituted within thought, which govern the rules constituted within thought, which govern thought, quote, are characterized by the fact that they are extended beyond the circumstances from which they arise. They do not account for the exception, and they misconstrue the accidental, confusing it with the general or the essential. The fact that the social world is integrated into this problematic even suggests that Hume is more advanced than Kant in this respect, for whom reason's internal critique of reason had no fulcrum or basis. Okay. So in other words, when Kant was using the critique to critique reason itself, it didn't have a proper starting off point. Okay. Have I lost you so far? Hello? Can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I forgot I had myself muted. Yeah, I was just saying that's interesting. That makes sense. I wasn't expecting that about Hume, but that's really interesting in comparison to Kant.
Well, Deleuze's reading of Hume, not
Yeah,
necessarily
yeah,
Hume himself.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That's what I mean.
So
Yeah.
then the next point, the genesis of faculties. Okay. Deleuze is perhaps unique among philosophers of the late 20th century in maintaining an active interest in the theory of the faculties, which he considered decisive. Okay, so what the faculties is the faculties of mind, such as, I can't think of any at the top of my head, but it's I wouldn't say it was discredited, but it's something that's unique to the time period that not too many philosophers have talked about. Kant did with the Doctrine of the Faculties, a later book. But that's the only one that can come to mind. Okay,
Okay.
so what else we got here? Okay, I think we can skip that. Next one, passive synthesis. All right. Passive synthesis instead of active synthesis. So the constitution of the self or the subject is passive synthesis, the operations of the mind with association. The synthesis in the mind of experience which brings about the subject. Yes. Okay. So here we find a final theme introduced in Deleuze's reading of Hume that will take on a greater range in subsequent work. In the first place, what shifts is the continuum between passive and active that is attributed to Hume. Quote Deleuze, the subject is an imprint or an impression left by principles that it progressively turns into a machine capable of using this impression. We'd seen this before. Instead, Deleuze's later work emphasizes the priority of passivity along with its continued fundamental role. In the chapter A Difference in Repetition dedicated to repetition itself, for example, in the thorough elaboration of the notion of passive synthesis with respect to the three temporal modalities, the role of active synthesis, which includes the aspects of subjective experience that are involved in Hume's empiricism, including in atomism, has a secondary and subsequently falsifying function. Okay, so then talk about anti-Oedipus, which I will not get into. Neither disjunctive synthesis. Okay, in empiricism and subjectivity, Deleuze is at pains to insist on the particularly empirical character of the synthetic activity that constitutes the subject, one which cannot be identified with either a simple psychology, which is itself accounted for on the basis of the empirical constitution of the subject, nor with transcendental philosophy. To quote Deleuze, in the case of Hume, nothing is transcendental. So, at the end, Joffe says, these points may even be summarized by saying that the subject, as it appears in Deleuze's mature work, is completely considered as a consequence and not at all as an agent with respect to what provides its support.
Right. There is no self, as we've been talking about.
Well, there is no self or subject.
Yeah.
As the prior point, or that it is an agent. No, it's not. It's something that is constituted by passive synthesis.
So why does Deleuze use the term subject rather than self?
Because I think it's a better theoretical term. When you're using such words, I've touched on this before. You got to be careful when you're discussing. You got to be careful with your terms. You also have to be careful with your terms within its historical context.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for example, classic one is if you're looking at Aristotle's one work called the De Anima, which is a Latin translation of periseukas, which is the original Greek. So psyche in the Greek refers to, one way to translate it is soul, but it's not in the sense of the Christian soul, something that survives the body after death.
Oh, it's that more
It's
Hellenistic understanding of it, that it perishes with your body when you die.
it's a biophysical element. Okay,
Okay.
so the psyche is what animates the particular body or the organism
Oh, okay.
that, yes, does not survive with the passing of the physical body.
Okay.
So that's where you have to be careful in using the term soul within its context, even though many common transitions of Aristotle refer to it as the soul
Oh, okay.
instead of the anima.
Right.
Okay, so with subject versus self, subject is a better theoretical term, in my opinion, because self carries with it some baggage.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so when you're talking about the theoretical subject, this is what it is, the constitution of the theoretical subject. And the subject is also something that is not gendered either. You can avoid that trap.
Is the term self gendered?
No, not necessarily. But when you talk about a subject, you make it a clean term, I guess you could say.
Okay.
Okay, so that's that.
Okay.
Let me see. Okay, so then the last section here on page, what is it? Page 81, Transcendental Empiricism. Okay, so Jaffe says, in summary, if there is a sense to the term empiricism in the phrase transcendental empiricism, with which Deleuze sometimes christens his project, it is not to be drawn from Hume. The great irony of Deleuze's transcendental empiricism, which is kind of a contradiction in terms, is thus that it is derived from Leibniz, Spinoza, and Kant, from rationalism and transcendental idealism, much more than from Hume's philosophy itself. Is this then to say that there is here an element of nostalgia in Deleuze, an attempt to express fidelity to a master whose work has long ceased to be relevant? It is rather the case that Hume's continued influence on Deleuze is irreducible to a homology of doctrine, meaning a similarity in doctrine. While the philosophy of association in its Humean form, along with the entire apparatus of rules for the formation and correction of consistency, have no place in Deleuze's transcendental empiricism, his philosophy remains Humean, since the great problems identified there in Deleuze's earliest research continue to inspire and problematize his work throughout. Or, to be more precise, transcendental empiricism is the name given to Deleuze's mature work for the philosophical position which takes up many of the problematics unearthed in his reading of Hume. Transcendental empiricism is not Humean, but it is the supreme consequence of Deleuze's engagement with problems that are marked out in Empiricism and Subjectivity, the book where he discusses Hume, such as the more fitting cause for claiming the mastery of another philosopher's work in relation to one's own, insofar as the problems, whose genetic status is another of Deleuze's discoveries, that trouble their work find pride of place in what comes afterwards. Okay, so I guess in other words, one way you define transcendental empiricism is he takes much of the insights from Hume, the empiricists, but he's not a radical empiricist in that respect, because already in Hume there was kind of a transcendental at work. When Hume is talking about impressions and ideas, which are themselves notions, concepts, and the operations of association, of which there is semblance, contiguity in time and place, and causation.
Right.
Okay? That's where the transcendental comes in. Now, also, you see this more specifically in Kant, where it's transcendental idealism. Transcendental doesn't mean existing in another realm. It means something that is above and over. You could even say it's like meta of the operation of what's involved.
I've heard Hayden use this term a lot before in terms
Meta?
of transcendental idealism.
Right. Transcendental idealism.
Yeah.
Right. That's Kant's project, transcendental idealism.
Yeah.
Idealism meaning existing within the mind, within the confines of reason, but the explanation of what happens in the mind. That's the transcendental respect. Now, when you get past Kant, you're going into the German idealist tradition. This is where it's not in the mind, everything is mind.
Okay.
Okay.
This sort of reminds me too of when Hayden was trying to explain to me the difference between transcendental and transcendent.
Yes.
And I was having trouble understanding that distinction.
Right. So in the classical religious conception is that God is something transcendental or transcendent, existing beyond the physical world. That's if you believe in God. But you can certainly use the word transcendental to describe what is going on with mental operations, the principles that govern it.
That doesn't necessarily have anything to do with God?
No, I'm talking about a difference between what explains it.
Okay.
Does it have anything to do with God? No, it doesn't.
Okay.
But he was right to make a distinction between transcendence and transcendental.
No, I'm asking if that is why there is that distinction, because transcendental does not have any. I mean, in addition to the operations of the mind, as you described, rather,
right?
That those operations of the mind don't necessarily have anything to do with God in the same way as describing something as transcendent does.
Well, it could, depending on how you're going to define it. Now, let's look at Hume again, where about associations. Okay. So associations are what the mind proceeds by. To explain about associations, you can use a transcendental framework to do this.
Okay.
And Deleuze's project is a transcendental empiricism because he is an empiricist, but he's
Okay.
also explaining this empiricism that is at work.
Okay. I
Okay.
think because of my history as a militant atheist, I still get tripped up by this religious language, even though I don't have a problem with religion or people being religious anymore.
Well, transcendental is not religious language, just to be clear.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Yeah, it's not religious language at all. You
Yeah.
can refer to God, in the classic Christian sense, as something transcendent.
Right.
That's not immanent. The opposite of transcendental is immanent, existing in the here and now,
Right.
in this plane of existence. And some people would say that God is immanent. You know,
Right.
particularly like Whitehead and the process philosophers. God is immanent, already existing in reality, is not separate from it.
Right.
But yes, part of the problem is that transcendence kind of has religious baggage.
Oh, yeah. And we also talked about that's what I mean by being tripped up by the religious language. And
Right.
I think we went into immanence when we were talking about John Duns Scotus, was that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, which
Yeah.
is also part of Deleuze's project, immanence,
Right.
an immanent ontology. He's not he is as much as possible trying to overturn Platonism, getting away from transcendental conceptions of Platonic ideas, and instead rooting this in the immanent. Everything is here in this plane of existence.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay, and we are finished with the Hume essay.
Okay.
Okay, so I think that was a good one. Really, really, I liked about the constitution of the subject. I think Deleuze really did a masterful job. And remember, this is his first monograph of taking that insight from Hume and deploying it effectively.
Yeah, I think so. I like what he did with that.
Yeah, and that's an important insight from Hume: is that no such thing as a self, or
Yeah.
there's a conventional understanding of something you could call a self, but the self is definitely not a substance.
Yeah.
You know.
Exactly.
Now,
The
also,
self this the self is just it's our brain tricking our body into thinking that we are a self in a way.
well, that's more of a modern reading, not in the human reading.
Yeah, I'm not talking about I guess I'm not talking about in relation to Hume. He has a slightly different understanding, but still I would say an equally valid one.
Yes, yes. So is the self an epiphenomenon or mental? They say here it gets confusing, and you could do a separate session, separate series on what the philosophy of mind is.
For sure.
Is what is mind? What are the operations of mind? This is where you get into qualia and all that stuff that I don't even have the time to go into right now because it's a whole separate path you can go on.
Yeah.
But one other thing I wanted to highlight here is I'll get to this in the prep material for Kant next time, is looking at Descartes with the cogito, for example. So the cogito, Descartes treated that as a substance.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's like relating to that idea of dualism and in within rationalism.
The mind and the body.
Yeah,
The mind,
there's
right?
a
The mind body
distinction
problem.
between, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the mind and body are two distinct substances,
Yeah.
which then engendered the problem. Okay, so then how do you explain the connection between the mind and the body? And what did Descartes do? He pointed to something called the pineal gland and said, "This is where they connect."
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like this new gland that they had just discovered. We don't know what it's for. Sure, I'll use that one.
Yeah.
Sure, it's the pineal psychology. Oh yes,
Yeah,
fun times there. But um, Kant said that that was an illusion of reason to treat it as a substance, the cogito.
I
Rather, the
agree.
cogito is um, Transcendental unity of apperception. Now you want to get back to transcendentalism here. This is the I, the transcendental I, which is
Right.
the thing you could say that binds all of the disparate perceptions together.
Okay.
That's the transcendental unity of apperception. And apperception means perceiving of perceiving. I am aware that I am perceiving.
Oh, that sounds like a word that Deleuze would enjoy.
Yes, yes, it would. We'll
Yeah.
see more of this when we get to Kant. But the reading here using Hume is that Hume is not even having that. The
Hmm.
self, cogito, whatever it is you want to call it, is not an actually existing thing as a substance. Rather,
Yeah.
it is a emergent phenomenon. I really like that term. An emergent phenomenon arising from, or epiphenomenal thing from the associations in the mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
Passive synthesis constitution of the subject. Okay.
Yeah.
So then going back to the earlier thing, the earlier notes that we have is that the passions or prior constitute the subject. And then moral philosophy provides the framework through which the subject can achieve its ends.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's the subject of moral philosophy. So, yes, what Hume is trying to do is providing the theoretical framework for human nature and for moral philosophy.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
really as
Exactly.
epistemology. That was more of like a side effect to that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. That's all I got. You got anything else?
Yeah, I think as I was looking at my notes, I had one more that it didn't sound like you went over, but um, yeah, this is a long one. This is a really long paragraph that I had written down because there's a lot of detail in it. Like it mentions Nietzsche and Bergson and
Hmm.
Jung and Plato. So I wanted to read this, and then maybe we could just clarify what it means, as long as it doesn't take too long.
Okay. So is this the paragraph on page 81?
It's the yeah, it says the conclusion. It's the conclusion about transcendental empiricism.
Okay. I can go ahead and read that one.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So this is on page 81. Jaffe says, if one examines the books published after empiricism and subjectivity, and after Deleuze's famous hiatus, it is not hard to see both strong departures from and strong criticisms of the Humean picture. The emphasis on philosophy as, quote, the theory of what we are doing, not the theory of what there is, interesting point, has given way to an affinity with Bersonian metaphysics and the beginnings of a philosophy of the virtual, explored both with respect to Bergson himself and to the Nietzschean theme of the will to power. We also discover a reading of Proust, that is Marcel Proust, that aligns itself not just with Bergson, but also at points with Jung and Plato. A reading which puts fundamental emphasis on the concept of essence. In the meaning, there is essence, like the sufficient reason for the other two terms and for the relation. In Proust and Signs, we also see a somewhat ambiguous but nonetheless decisive critique of association. Deleuze's Nietzsche is not the acute psychologist of the earlier writings, nor really even the far-sighted cultural critic of the middle works. That it is hard to think of Nietzsche's, quote, superior empiricism on the model of Hume's, but the metaphysically inclined author of The Will to Power. The will to power as differential kernel of qualities, and above all the eternal return, are the Nietzschean legacy in Deleuze, the two themes in Nietzsche which seem to most radically depart from the constructivist and jurisprudential version of the world offered in empiricism and subjectivity. Finally, the works that close the 1960s and the books with Guattari that follow stand on the other side of an unbridgeable abyss from Hume's treatise. Okay, so the first point is constructivist and jurisprudential version of the world. Okay, that's where the moral philosophy comes in, the reading from Hume. So remember, empiricism and subjectivity is Deleuze's first monograph, 1956. Later on, he did monographs on Nietzsche, Spinoza, Proust. Um, who else? Two on Spinoza,
Right.
Leibniz. Okay, so these are everything that comes after empiricism and subjectivity. So empiricism and subjectivity is definitely early Deleuze. So
Okay.
Bergson, Yes, he did. He did do a monograph on Bergson. So the main insight from Bergson is about flux, experience as flux.
Mhm.
And then the Nietzschean theme of the will to power. Okay, so in prior podcasts, we've already gone over what the will to power is. And the insight taken from there is that the will to power is is a constitutive element at work.
Mhm.
It's not about psychology. Saying metaphysically inclined author of the will to power. Remember the essay we did about Heidegger?
Yeah.
When God is dead? Okay.
Yeah.
And this is where Heidegger calls Nietzsche the last great metaphysician because of the will to
Yes.
power.
Yeah.
Okay. So Proust is also about time, particularly the remembrance of things past, stream of consciousness, how memory constitute things. Jung, I would say the archetype. There's lots of different themes that you could pull out of here. And yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a little disjointed. It's a little disparate. That's what you could pull out of here. We'll see this later on.
Yeah. That helps clarify those details though, because there's a lot of detail in that paragraph.
Yes. Yes, there is. Okay. That's all I got.
All right. Well, thanks a lot as per usual for going into this, and looks like the next one is Kant.
Hmm.
That makes sense since he was mentioning Kant and mentioning Hume a lot, and those comparisons that we talked about are interesting. All right, so yeah, thanks everyone so much for watching another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Hope you found this next philosophy episode to be as fascinating as I did, and like I always say, thanks so much to everyone who likes and shares this video, and to those of you who have subscribed to my channel, and especially to those of you who want to give me money on Patreon. That's always much appreciated, and I'll put the link in the description for this video like I always do. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right. Any last words there, Tim?
um, no, I'm fresh out. We'll have to save
Okay.
it for next time.
All right. All right. So, and thanks everyone so much for watching, and keep having mindgasms, and adios until next time.